The press conference was Tony Stark's idea, which meant it was equal parts brilliance and catastrophic miscalculation. Stark Towers Plaza had been transformed overnight into something resembling a military parade ground, dressed up for a charity gala. Blue and gold banners snapped in the October wind. Camera drones buzzed in tight formation above a raised podium where Maria Hill stood reviewing her talking points with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she had already imagined 17 ways this could go wrong. Behind her, a row of Avengers stood in civilian clothes trying to look approachable. Steve Rogers managed it naturally. Thor did not. Bruce Banner kept glancing at the sky. The message was simple. The Avengers were accountable to the public, transparent, human even. Tony had used the word relatable approximately 40 times in the planning meeting, which had caused Natasha Romanoff to leave the room twice, 300 journalists, 6 news helicopters, 1 live global feed. It was by any measure the worst possible moment for a dimensional rift to open directly above Manhattan. It started as sound. A low-frequency vibration that reporters initially assumed was a subway tremor, the kind New York absorbs without comment. But this one climbed. It moved up through the chest cavity, bypassed the ears entirely, and settled somewhere behind the eyes like a thought that did not belong to you. Camera operators grabbed their equipment. Pigeons vacated a 6-block radius with collective, panicked unanimity. Then the sky cracked, not metaphorically. The air above the plaza split along a vertical seam approximately 40 feet up, and what came through the gap was not light. It was the absence of something, a tearing in the fabric of the visible world that bled darkness the way a wound bleeds red. The temperature dropped 11 degrees in 4 seconds. Maria Hill later described it in her report as similar to standing next to an open freezer. If the freezer contained something that hated you personally, he came through feet first, trailing chains. The chains were the first thing anyone registered because they moved independently. Not swinging with momentum or gravity, but writhing, coiling, reaching, as though each link contained a separate and agitated intelligence. They were black as engine oil and caught no light at all, which should have been impossible given 6 news helicopters worth of camera lighting flooding the plaza. They simply refused to reflect. They absorbed. The figure attached to them hit the concrete with enough force to crater it, both knees down, one fist planted, the other gripping a weapon that took the assembled journalists approximately 3 full seconds to process as a battle axe the size of a reasonable man's torso. He rose slowly. Al Simmons, once a government assassin, once a man with a wife named Wanda and a life he had believed in, stood in the October light of a world that was not his own and looked exactly like what he was. The necroplasm suit moved across his body like living shadow, constantly shifting, the red cape billowing behind him in a wind that had nothing to do with Manhattan's weather. His face, what little showed beneath the white skull-like mask, was a landscape of scar tissue, the record of a death he had not been permitted to keep. His eyes burned, not metaphorically, not as a trick of the light. They burned with a cold green fire that the camera drones captured in perfect high definition and transmitted to approximately 400 million viewers worldwide. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then everyone started screaming. Thor moved first, which was the correct instinct applied with perhaps too much confidence. He cleared the distance between the podium and the crater in a single stride, Mjolnir rising. His voice carried the particular register he reserved for beings he considered genuinely dangerous, the one that dropped about an octave below his public speaking tone. "Halt, identify yourself and state your purpose here." Spawn looked at him. There was a quality to that look that stopped Thor, not through any active power, but through sheer density of experience. Al Simmons had been dead, had bargained with a devil, had fought angels and demons, and returned from depths of corruption that would have consumed anything less stubborn than a man who refused to stop being angry. When he looked at Thor, he was not looking at a threat assessment. He was looking at someone new in a situation he did not yet understand, which was a state he had learned to approach with extreme caution. "I don't know where I am," Spawn said. His voice was low, roughed at the edges, carrying the particular flatness of someone who had long since stopped performing emotions for external consumption. Last thing I remember was a portal. Violator's work, probably, or something worse. Thor's hammer did not lower. You arrived through a dimensional breach above one of Earth's most populated cities. I noticed. You carry weapons of infernal design. Also noticed. Rogers was already moving civilians back, his voice calm, and carrying the specific authority that made people obey before they understood why. Banner had retreated to the building's edge and was doing controlled breathing exercises with the focused desperation of a man on a very narrow ledge. Natasha had a sidearm out, not pointed, but ready, while her eyes catalogued everything with professional thoroughness. The chains moved, they did not strike. They rose around Spawn in loose formation, not aggressive but present, the way a large animal's hackles rise, and the nearest camera drone veered sharply backward as though shoved by an invisible hand. The necroplasm suit pulsed once, a subtle darkening across the shoulders and chest, and the temperature in the plaza dropped another 4 degrees. Not here to fight, Spawn said, and there was something almost tired in it, not weakness. The tiredness of someone who has fought more than any person should and found it rarely solved what needed solving. If I wanted a fight, I would have landed differently. The crater in our plaza suggests otherwise, Stark said. He had arrived at Thor's shoulder wearing the gauntlet portion of his armor, the repulsor already charged to a level that represented genuine intent rather than warning shot. The suit's AI was running 17 simultaneous analyses on the necroplasm readings and returning results that Iron Man found personally offensive in their incomprehensibility. Friday can't classify what you're wearing. That bothers me more than the axe. It's not technology. I got that. What is it? Spawn looked down at the suit as if he had been asked to explain a scar. It's a consequence. Blocks north, a black SUV pulled to a stop on a rooftop parking structure. The woman inside did not work for S.H.I.E.L.D., though she had their frequency dialed and was listening with complete attention. She worked for an organization whose name appeared on no government database, one concerned specifically with supernatural incursion events. She photographed Spawn through a long lens and sent the image to a server in a Geneva basement with a single-word annotation. Hellspawn. Confirmed. The hand had known for 6 minutes. They were already moving. Mephisto, who did not experience time the way mortals did, became aware of the necroplasm signature approximately simultaneously with the plaza impact and felt something he rarely felt. Not concern exactly, something more like the sensation of finding an unexpected variable in an equation he had considered complete. He sat in his dimension and turned the sensation over, examining it from multiple angles, and concluded that this required attention. Necroplasm was not his. It was adjacent to his domain without being subject to it, which created a category of problem he found intellectually interesting and pragmatically dangerous. He filed it appropriately and began to plan. Back in the plaza, the standoff had settled into an uncomfortable equilibrium. Spawn had not moved. The Avengers had not advanced. The journalists who had not been evacuated were recording everything from behind a hastily erected shield barrier, which meant 400 million viewers were watching a figure from a dimension Marvel's greatest heroes had never documented hold a conversation with Thor and Tony Stark about the nature of his clothing. It would become the most watched clip in internet history by midnight. Rogers stepped forward. He had holstered nothing because he carried nothing to holster, and there was something in that unarmed approach that shifted the energy of the encounter by a measurable degree. He stopped at the edge of the crater and looked up at Spawn with the particular expression he wore when he was deciding to trust someone before he had evidence to justify it. You said you didn't know where you are. Can you tell us where you came from? Spawn studied him. A city called New York. Pause that followed was the kind that rewrites a situation. Rogers looked at Stark. That's where we are. Different one. Spawn's voice carried no particular drama. He had long since exhausted his capacity for being surprised by the universe's structural cruelty. Mine's darker. Axe lowered slightly, not all the way, but slightly. It was at that precise moment that the Hand made their entrance, because the Hand had a gift for timing that was indistinguishable from genuine evil. 16 ninjas dropped from the surrounding buildings simultaneously, moving with the liquid silence of people who had died and returned and no longer experienced fear as a deterrent. They were not targeting the Avengers. Their formation made that immediately clear to anyone watching. They were targeting Spawn, surrounding him in a configuration designed for capture rather than elimination, which suggested they wanted the necroplasm intact. Spawn looked at the circle of ninjas, looked at the Avengers, looked back at the ninjas. The chains moved. What followed lasted 11 seconds. Spawn did not use the axe. He did not need to. The necroplasm suit extended in controlled bursts, the chains operating as extensions of his will rather than physical weapons, and 8 Hand operatives discovered simultaneously that necroplasm interacted with their undead physiology in ways that their leadership had very much failed to warn them about. The other 8 reconsidered their positioning with significant urgency. The Avengers stood and watched. It was Thor who said it quietly to no one in particular. He is not fighting to destroy, he is fighting to warn. The last Hand operative standing looked at Spawn, looked at the precise and controlled devastation around him, and retreated to deliver a report that would result in considerable organizational reassessment. Spawn turned back to the Avengers. The chains settled, the suit stilled. "You were going to help," he said. "It was not quite a question. We were assessing," Stark said. "You were watching. There was no accusation in it, just observation. I'm familiar with the feeling." It was Rogers who moved first, extending a hand not toward a weapon but toward Spawn in the oldest gesture of human intent. "Steve Rogers, we have a lot of questions." Spawn looked at the Hand for a moment. Al Simmons, who had been burned alive, who had clawed his way out of hell on a promise and a grudge, who had fought in the darkness of a city that mostly preferred to pretend he did not exist, reached out and shook it. "Al Simmons, I have some too." Somewhere in the crowd behind the shield barrier, a man in a red suit with no eye holes had watched the entire encounter from a position that gave him an excellent view while maintaining plausible deniability. Matt Murdock could not see Spawn, but he could hear his heartbeat, and what he heard had stopped him completely. It was not the heartbeat that disturbed him. It was the second one beneath it, the one that did not belong to any living thing, that beat in a rhythm no human heart had ever maintained, slow and deep and patient as something waiting at the bottom of a very dark well. Murdoch pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "Foggy," he said, "I need you to pull everything we have on supernatural law, all of it, tonight." Above Manhattan, the dimensional rift sealed itself with a sound like the world exhaling, and left behind only the crater, the cameras, and a question that 400 million people were already arguing about in real time. What exactly had just arrived? And if you want to see more of Hell's greatest warrior navigating a world that has no idea what to do with him, hit that subscribe button and drop what character you want to see enter the Marvel Universe next in the comments below. The dark never sleeps, and neither do we. The holding room shield chose for Al Simmons said everything about how they had classified him. It was not a cell, technically. The distinction mattered to Maria Hill, who had spent considerable energy ensuring the paperwork reflected guest rather than prisoner, because the paperwork would eventually be reviewed by people who cared about such things. But the walls were reinforced vibranium composite. The ceiling contained 17 sensor arrays. The single chair bolted to the floor was rated to withstand forces that would have leveled a city block, and the air cycled through a filtration system, originally designed to contain biological agents of the most extreme classification. They had also, at Tony Stark's specific request, installed a coffee maker. "It's a gesture," Stark had explained to Hill, who had looked at him with the expression she reserved for explanations that explain nothing. "It says we're not afraid of him. It says we're civilized. It says we're the kind of operation that offers refreshments." Spawn had not touched the coffee. He sat in the corner of the room, not in the chair, on the floor with his back against the wall and one knee raised, the axe across his lap, the chains coiled around him in a loose approximation of rest. He had not moved in 3 hours. Sensors were registering readings that Friday described. with unusual diplomatic care, as outside established parameters for every known category of being, including but not limited to enhanced humans, mutants, Asgardians, celestial-touched individuals, and previously documented supernatural entities. He was, in the language of S.H.I.E.L.'s classification system, something new. He was also, in the language of Al Simmons, exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. The door opened. He did not reach for the axe. The footsteps were wrong for a threat, too deliberate, too even, carrying the particular rhythm of someone accustomed to navigating spaces by sound rather than sight. The man who entered was not large. He wore a charcoal suit that had seen better days and a pair of glasses that were clearly decorative given the white cane folded under his arm. He moved through the sensor-laden room with a confidence that suggested he had already mapped it from the doorway. Matt Murdock stopped 6 feet from Spawn and did not pretend to look at him. "Mr. Simmons, my name is Matt Murdock. I'm a lawyer." Spawn looked at him for a long moment. "They sent a lawyer. Nobody sent me. I invited myself." Murdock found the second chair that had been placed near the door, the one not bolted down, the one that said this was a conversation rather than an interrogation, and sat in it with the ease of someone completely comfortable in uncomfortable situations. S.H.I.E.L.D. has a habit of operating in legal gray areas when they encounter things they don't have categories for. I have a habit of showing up when that happens. You're not just a lawyer. Murdock's expression did not change. What makes you say that? The way you move, the way you're listening right now. Spawn's voice carried no particular accusation. Simple observation, the same flat cataloging he applied to everything. You heard something at the plaza, that's why you're here. A beat of silence. Murdock had interviewed enough people in enough rooms to recognize when pretense was counterproductive. He folded his cane across his knees. "I heard 2 heartbeats," he said quietly. "One human, one that isn't." Chains shifted, a slow and unconscious movement, the way a person's hands move when they are processing something emotionally difficult. "Necroplasm," Spawn said. "It's the substance that makes the suit, makes me. It's connected to a hell dimension called Mailbolger's realm. It keeps me functional. It also means I'm not entirely alive in any way your senses are going to recognize." Murdock absorbed this without visible reaction, which Spawn noted and filed. "Are you a threat to the people in this city?" "Depends which people. Civilians, the ones who don't make the choices that bring things like this down on them." Something shifted in Spawn's posture, a minute adjustment, the kind that was invisible to anyone relying on eyes alone. Murdock heard his second heartbeat change rhythm. "No," Spawn said. "Never them." Murdock nodded once, with the finality of a man who had just reached a verdict. "Then I'm your lawyer. Don't talk to S.H.I.E.L.D. without me present." What followed over the next 18 hours was a masterclass in institutional anxiety. Dr. Strange arrived from the sanctum sanctorum with the particular expression he wore when reality had done something he considered personally inconsiderate. He spent 40 minutes in the observation room reviewing the sensor data before requesting entry, which Friday granted after cross-referencing his clearance 17 times. He entered carrying no obvious weapons and radiating the quiet authority of someone who had looked into the actual face of cosmic annihilation and found it, if not manageable, at least navigable. He sat across from Spawn and studied him the way an expert studies something that challenges the boundaries of their expertise. "Necroplasm," Strange said without preamble. "It's not from any hell dimension I have documented." Spawn agreed. "It wouldn't be. Your dimension has its own supernatural hierarchy. Angels, demons, a separate celestial bureaucracy." Strange's tone remained academic, but his eyes were doing something more active than passive observation. "In our universe, the supernatural hierarchy runs through entities like Mephisto, Dormammu, Nightmare. They have established territories, agreements. A functional, if deeply unpleasant order. I know what Mephisto is," Spawn said. The temperature in the room dropped 2 degrees. "Different name in my world, same business model." Strange heard something in that answer that tightened his expression. "He'll know you're here, if he doesn't already." "Knows." Spawn said it with the certainty of someone who has spent enough time in proximity to demonic intelligence to understand how it operates. "He's been aware since the moment I came through. He's not moving yet because he doesn't know what I am." Demons don't rush what they don't understand. They gather information, then they move. Strange was quiet for a moment. You have experience with this. I have experience with everything I wish I didn't have experience with. It was the most personal thing Spawn had said since arriving. Strange recognized it as such and did not pursue it, which was the correct instinct and the one that moved the needle of the conversation from interrogation to something more honest. I'd like to study the necroplasm, Strange said. Not extract, not contain, observe with your consent. Spawn looked at him. Why? Because something from outside our dimensional framework has arrived carrying power that intersects with our supernatural hierarchy in ways I don't understand. In my experience, things I don't understand have a tendency to become problems I wasn't prepared for. If you understand it, then I'm better prepared. Another long silence. The chains coiled and uncoiled in their slow, thoughtful rhythm. Murdoch stays in the room, Spawn said. Strange glanced at the lawyer in the corner, who had been sitting with his hands folded and his attention absolute for the past 20 minutes. Agreed. The Avengers assessment meeting happened simultaneously in the tower's upper conference room, which meant it happened in the particular atmosphere of people who disagreed with each other being required to reach consensus under time pressure. Stark had the sensor data on the main display, cycling through readings that resisted interpretation with what felt like active stubbornness. Thor stood with his arms crossed, which was his default posture for situations he found philosophically complicated. Natasha had a tablet and was reading a file that S.H.I.E.L.D.'s Supernatural Division had compiled in the past 12 hours, which was thin and mostly speculative. Banner was present via screen from a floor below, where he had chosen to remain for reasons that did not require explanation. Rogers stood at the window. He fought the hand to warn them off, not to destroy them, Rogers said without turning. That's a choice, that's restraint. That's also the move you make if you want to appear non-threatening to the people watching, Natasha said, not unkindly. He knew we were there, he knew the cameras were running. He's been in our system for 12 hours and hasn't asked for anything, Rogers continued. No demands, no threats, no attempt to leave. The containment field helps with that last one, Stark said. He could breach the containment field, Thor said quietly. The room attended to this. I have stood in proximity to the necroplasm. It is not technology. It is not magic in any form I recognize from Asgard or any realm within the Nine. Attempting to contain it with vibranium composite and energy arrays is the equivalent of building a dam from paper. He paused. He is staying because he chooses to stay. Room absorbed this, which means he wants something from us, Natasha said. Or he wants to figure out where he is before he does anything else, Rogers said. That's not threat behavior, that's sense. Stark leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. Friday's best analysis of the necroplasm suggests it operates through a dimension adjacent to what Strange classifies as the Hell Realms. Different source, different rules, but functionally overlapping territory, which means Mephisto is going to take an interest. He paused. Mephisto taking an interest in anything happening in our backyard is not a situation I approach with calm. Then we have a common enemy before we have a common alliance, Rogers said, turning from the window. That's a starting point. Or it's a story someone very smart is telling us, Natasha said. It could be both, Banner said from the screen. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Rogers looked around the room with the measured patience of a man who had learned to build consensus out of disagreement because the alternative was catastrophe. We observe, we talk to him. We give Strange time to learn what he can. And we don't make any moves that close off options before we need to. He met Natasha's eyes. Agreed, a pause. Then a nod. It was Murdoch who brought Spawn food, not because S.H.I.E.L.D. had forgotten, but because he had insisted on doing it himself, which had caused a minor bureaucratic incident that he had resolved by citing 3 separate municipal codes with the fluency of someone who had committed them to memory for exactly this kind of situation. He set the tray down without fanfare and took his chair. You could leave, Murdoch said. I think we both know that. Spawn did not look at the food. I know, so why are you still here? The chains moved in their slow, meditative way. Outside the sealed room, Manhattan continued at its usual pace, entirely unaware that 2 blocks away a man who had been to hell and back was was sitting on a vibranium floor having a conversation with a blind lawyer who moonlighted as the city's most violent protector. Spent years operating alone in a city where everyone wanted me dead or controlled or studied, Spawn said. Criminals, agencies, angels, demons, everyone had a category they wanted to put me in. He looked at the ceiling. This is the first time someone sent a lawyer. Murdoch's mouth curved slightly. It made an impression. Made me think you might be worth talking to. It was not warmth exactly. It was the specific acknowledgement of one person who operated in the dark to another, the recognition of shared geography even when the maps were different. Murdoch heard it in the way the second heartbeat steadied. Hand will come back, Murdoch said. They want whatever you're carrying, and when they come back they won't use a formation that assumes you'll hold back. I know. S.H.I.E.L.D. is going to want to move you to a more secure location, which in practice means a location where they have more control. I know that too. What do you actually want, Mr. Simmons? The question sat in the room for a long moment. Al Simmons, who had wanted many things in his life and in his death, who had wanted justice and revenge and peace, and the chance to speak to a woman named Wanda one more time, who had wanted to understand why a man who had tried to do good had been condemned and manipulated and reduced and rebuilt into something the world feared, looked at the floor of a holding room in a universe that was not his own. To understand where I am, he said finally, and whether there's a way back. And if there isn't, he paused, to find something worth doing while I'm here. Murdoch nodded slowly. Those are the three most reasonable things anyone has said to me in this building, he said, and I've been coming here for 4 years. Spawn looked at him directly for the first time since Murdoch had entered the room. You fight at night, Spawn said. I can see it in how you hold yourself, the way the suit sits, the healed breaks in your hands. Murdoch did not confirm or deny. Lots of people fight at night, like that. Another silence, but different this time. The silence of two people who have stopped performing and are simply present with each other in a shared and complicated reality. Hell's Kitchen, Murdoch said finally. My neighborhood, it has a persistent problem with organized crime and supernatural incursion. The second part has gotten worse in the last 2 years. He paused. I could use someone who knows how to handle both. Spawn looked at him for a long moment, asking me to patrol with you. I'm suggesting that two people with overlapping concerns and complementary capabilities might find it useful to operate in proximity. That's a very lawyer way of saying patrol. I practice law for a living. It carries over. The first time since arriving in a universe that was not his own, in a body that was not entirely alive, wearing a suit made of the consequences of choices he had not fully understood when he made them. Al Simmons produced something that was almost, in the right light, a laugh. It was brief. It was rough. It did not reach his eyes, which still burned with their cold green fire, but it was there. 3 floors above, in the observation room, Rogers watched the sensor readings and said nothing. Natasha stood beside him, watching the same data, and after a moment said something she said rarely and meant every time. I think I was wrong about him. Rogers nodded. Neither of them mentioned that in the northeastern corner of the sensor grid, a reading had appeared and disappeared in the space of 2 seconds. Something had been observing the holding room from a location that should have been impossible to observe from. Something that left a thermal signature consistent with no known entity in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s database. Something that had seen enough. Mephisto did not appear dramatically. That was the thing people consistently misunderstood about him. The dramatic appearances, the columns of hellfire, the throne room revelations, those were performances. Carefully constructed theater designed to establish psychological dominance before any conversation began. Mephisto had been conducting such performances for longer than most civilizations had existed, and he had learned that the most effective moments of genuine power were the quiet ones. He appeared in Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum at 3 in the morning, as a man in a tailored red suit sitting in the chair nearest the fire, holding a glass of something amber that he had helped himself to from Strange's cabinet, looking for all the world like a house guest who had arrived slightly ahead of schedule. Strange materialized from the staircase with the cloak of levitation already active and 3 containment spells cycling through his fingers before he had fully processed what he was seeing. Mephisto raised his glass in greeting. "Sit down, Stephen. This isn't a confrontation. If I wanted a confrontation, I would have chosen a venue with better acoustics." He glanced around the sanctum with the appreciative eye of someone assessing real estate. "Though I will say, the collection has improved. The Codex Imperium on the third shelf is a particularly nice acquisition." Strange did not sit. But he let the containment spells idle rather than release, which was the conversational equivalent of keeping a hand near a weapon without drawing it. "What do you want? Information first, then an arrangement." Mephisto set down the glass with the precise care of someone who respects fine things while remaining entirely indifferent to their owners. "The entity currently residing in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s least effective holding facility. Tell me what you know about him." "Then you do." "Considerably more than you think, actually. You've spent 19 hours studying his necroplasm through every diagnostic lens in your considerable arsenal." Mephisto smiled. It was a good smile, which was the most unsettling thing about it. "What did you find?" Strange was quiet for a moment, calculating the cost of various responses. "Necroplasm originates from a held dimension external to our framework," he said finally. "It operates under different metaphysical rules. The entity who created it, who bound Simmons to it, is not subject to the agreements that govern supernatural territorial claims in our universe." "Correct." Mephisto's tone carried the specific warmth of a teacher whose student has arrived at the right answer, which creates a problem. Everyone, Stephen, I want you to understand that clearly before you dismiss this as self-interest." He leaned forward slightly. "My domain has rules, boundaries. Arrangements with every significant supernatural power in this universe, arrangements that have maintained a functional, if unpleasant, order for longer than your civilization has had written language. Simmons exists outside those arrangements. His necroplasm is not subject to my authority or Dormammu's or any power currently operating within our framework." He paused. "He is, in the technical language of supernatural law, a jurisdictional anomaly. You want him removed." "I want him contained, which is different. Removed would mean returning him to his dimension, which closes the problem neatly." Mephisto picked up his glass again. "But the portal that brought him here has already destabilized. He cannot go back, not yet, possibly not ever." Another pause, timed with the precision of long practice. "Which means his necroplasm is operating freely in a framework it was never designed for, attracting attention from entities who are very much not bound by my arrangements, and creating what I would describe as an invitation." Strange heard the weight in that final word. An invitation to what? Renegotiate everything. Mephisto's voice remained conversational, but something moved behind his eyes, the glimpse of a depth that had nothing to do with humanity. "There are powers adjacent to our framework who have been waiting for exactly this kind of disruption. An external supernatural element that doesn't fit existing categories creates an argument for reclassifying territorial boundaries, for challenging agreements, for opening questions that have been settled for millennia." He set the glass down again, finally, and looked at Strange with something that was almost directness. "Need Simmons stable, documented, and operating within a defined framework before those powers decide his anomalous status is an opportunity. You need him on someone's leash. I need him on a leash that isn't mine. I am aware that my acquiring him directly would cause exactly the kind of jurisdictional crisis I am trying to prevent." Mephisto stood, smoothing his jacket with the unhurried precision of a man with unlimited time. "I am suggesting, Stephen, that you provide that framework. Document him, classify him, give him a defined status within our supernatural order, make him, legally and metaphysically speaking, a known quantity." He moved toward the door, which opened without being touched. "And if I don't," Strange said. Mephisto paused without turning. "Then the entities waiting on the threshold of our framework will draw their own conclusions about what his presence means. And the arrangements that have kept this universe's supernatural order functional will become significantly more complicated." He stepped through the door. "Think of it as preventive maintenance. You're rather good at that." Door closed. Strange stood in the firelit room for a long moment, the containment spells still cycling through his fingers, and thought about the specific quality of danger that came wrapped in reasonable arguments. Then he went to wake Murdoch. The hand moved on the 14th floor of a midtown building at 4:47 in the morning, not towards S.H.I.E.L.D.'s facility. That was the detail that mattered. The hand's leadership had assessed the holding room situation and reached the correct conclusion that a direct extraction attempt would fail and alert every significant power in the city simultaneously. Instead, they moved toward the building's external server array, where S.H.I.E.L.D. had routed the sensor data from Spawn's holding room through a secondary analysis system. They wanted the necroplasm readings, the composition data, the dimensional signature. They had a buyer. The operative who reached the server array first was good enough that she had neutralized 2 S.H.I.E.L.D. security personnel and was 3 minutes into a data extraction before she heard anything at all. What she heard was a sound she could not immediately categorize, a low-frequency vibration that climbed from the floor through her boots and settled behind her sternum. Then the wall to her left came apart, not explosively. The vibranium composite panel separated at its seams with a deliberate, controlled precision that was somehow more alarming than destruction would have been, and the figure that stepped through the gap was not what any hand operative had been briefed to expect. Spawn looked at the extraction equipment, looked at the operative, looked at the unconscious security personnel. "Where does that data go?" he said. Not a question. A statement with an answer required. The operative reached for her weapon. The chains moved faster. Murdoch came through the ceiling access panel approximately 4 seconds later, which was 4 seconds after the situation had been resolved, and landed in a room that contained one restrained hand operative, one intact server array with its extraction device removed, and Spawn standing in the corner looking at the city through the gap in the wall. "You left the holding room," Murdoch said. "The containment field has a 17-second reset cycle between active pulses. The necroplasm can phase through vibranium composite during the gap if I apply the right frequency of resonance." Spawn did not turn from the window. "I've known since the second hour." Murdoch absorbed this. "You stayed anyway. I want to see who would come for the data. That tells me more than the data tells them." He finally turned. "The hand isn't working alone. They have a buyer for the necroplasm composition, someone who wants to understand what I'm made of before they make a move." "Mephisto," Murdoch said. A pause. "You know, Strange called me 20 minutes ago." Murdoch moved through the room with the careful steps of someone mapping new terrain. "Mephisto wants you classified, contained within an existing framework. He says it's to prevent a jurisdictional crisis. It's to prevent me from being outside his control," Spawn said. "In my world, the demonic hierarchy spent years trying to bring me to heel. Different names, same architecture." The chains coiled slowly. "Mephisto doesn't want me classified for the universe's benefit. He wants me classified because an unclassified supernatural entity with necroplasm-based power represents a crack in his authority. Other powers will use that crack if they can. Strange thinks he might be telling the truth about the jurisdictional threat. Probably is. Both things can be true." Spawn looked at the restrained operative. "Get what you need from her. I'll wait." Murdoch crouched beside the operative and began asking questions in the particular tone he used when he needed complete answers quickly, and Spawn stood at the gap in the wall and looked at Manhattan. His Manhattan had the same skyline, roughly, the same density of light, the same quality of darkness between the buildings where things moved that the lights could not reach. He had spent years in those gaps. He wondered, with the specific wondering of someone who has stopped expecting good answers, whether this version of the city needed the same kind of presence in its dark places. Whether what he was, the thing he had become through death and corruption and stubborn refusal to stop, was something this world could use. Whether being useful was enough of a reason to stay. The operative talked. The name she gave for the buyer was not Mephisto, which meant the hand had better operational security than their field presence suggested. But the routing of the data transfer, the specific server chain Murdoch identified from the extraction device's memory, pointed to a location in the Midwest that S.H.I.E.L.D.'s database connected to a research division of an organization that had been officially dissolved 7 years ago. AIM. Advanced Idea Mechanics. Unofficially dissolved, it turned out. They want to synthesize necroplasm, Murdoch said, reviewing the data on his phone through an app that translated visual information to tactile output, a Stark Industries design he had accepted with considerable reluctance and used with considerable skill. They've been attempting to access supernatural energy sources for 18 months. The necroplasm readings from the plaza gave them a composition profile they couldn't have generated independently. Synthetic necroplasm, Spawn said. The chains tightened around him, an involuntary response, the way a person's fist closes when something violates something they consider fundamental. They have no idea what they're dealing with. Enlighten me. Necroplasm isn't energy. It's not a substance you synthesize and apply. His voice dropped to a register that carried weight beyond volume. It's a binding. It's what connects a soul to a specific kind of damnation. It keeps me functional and it keeps me controlled. And the entity that designed it did so with the specific intention that it would always serve his purposes. Trying to synthesize it without the source framework is like trying to replicate a leash without understanding that the leash is also a collar and also the thing holding the animal together. What happens if they succeed? They don't create a weapon, they create a hole. Spawn looked at him. A hole in the barrier between this dimension and whatever is adjacent to it. And whatever comes through that hole will not be controllable by the people who made it. Murdoch was quiet for a moment, processing the implications with the focused speed of a mind trained for exactly this kind of cascading consequence mapping. We need to tell Strange, he said. We need to do more than tell him. Spawn picked up the extraction device and closed his hand around it. The necroplasm absorbed it with a sound like a quiet exhale. We need to move before AIM does, and before Mephisto realizes that AIM is working the same problem from a different angle. You think Mephisto doesn't know about AIM? I think Mephisto's primary concern is jurisdictional authority, which means he's focused on me as the anomaly. AIM's research is a secondary thread he may not have traced yet. Spawn moved toward the ceiling access panel. It won't stay secondary long. When he finds it, he'll move to either stop it or use it, depending on which serves his interests better. Either option is dangerous. Murdoch followed him through the access panel and into the maintenance corridor above, and they moved through the building's upper structure in the particular silence of two people who had independently developed the skill of being invisible in enclosed spaces. Been planning this since the holding room, Murdoch said, not an accusation. An observation made with something adjacent to respect. Been planning since I came through the portal, Spawn said. Old habit, new universe, same architecture. Rogers called the meeting for 6 in the morning, which meant everyone arrived with coffee, except Thor, who arrived with the specific alertness of someone whose biology did not require sleep, and who had spent the night reading S.H.I.E.L.'s complete file on supernatural incursion events with the focused attention of a general reviewing tactical intelligence. Strange arrived last, which communicated the nature of his night without requiring explanation. Spawn was present, which caused a brief and significant moment of institutional discomfort among the S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel, resolved when Murdoch produced a document he had apparently drafted between 4:47 and 5:30 in the morning that established Spawn's legal status as a cooperative witness and consulting party rather than a detained subject, and which contained enough correctly cited precedent that Hill took it and read it twice before concluding that challenging it would cost more time than accepting it. AIM has a 14-month head start on necroplasm synthesis research, Strange said, once the room had settled. He had the data from the extraction device on the display, translated through his own analytical framework into something the assembled group could interpret. Based on the composition analysis they acquired from the plaza readings, they are approximately 8 to 12 weeks from a viable attempt. Viable meaning what exactly? Stark said. Viable meaning they will attempt to open a dimensional interface using synthetic necroplasm as the mechanism. Strange's voice carried the flatness of someone delivering a prognosis they would prefer not to be giving. Based on what Simmons has told me about necroplasm's actual metaphysical function, the attempt will not produce what AIM intends. What will it produce? Rogers said. an uncontrolled aperture in the barrier between this dimension and the adjacent space that necroplasm is sourced from. Strange paused, which in practical terms means an opening that entities from that adjacent space can use. What kind of entities? Banner said from his screen. Everyone looked at Spawn. The chains were still. The suit was still. Spawn looked at the table for a moment with the expression of someone choosing which truth to tell from a selection of truths, all of them difficult. In my universe, the space adjacent to the necroplasm source is occupied by both demonic and divine powers engaged in a war over human souls, he said. The specific entities that operate in that space include beings that make Mephisto look like a minor inconvenience. They have been conducting that war for longer than this planet has existed, and they have zero interest in the welfare of any dimension they pass through. They want souls. They want the raw material of human spiritual energy, and an uncontrolled aperture in your dimensional barrier is equivalent to leaving a door open in a building full of what they consider livestock. Room was very quiet. That's the optimistic interpretation, Spawn added. Natasha looked at him steadily. What's the pessimistic one? That Mephisto figures out what AIM is doing and decides that the resulting chaos is actually useful to him. That a dimensional crisis gives him justification to expand his territorial authority under the emergency provisions of whatever supernatural agreements govern this universe. That he lets AIM open the door, manages the immediate crisis in a way that positions him as the solution rather than a participant, and emerges from it with significantly more control over this dimension's supernatural hierarchy than he currently has. Spawn looked at Strange. That's what a male Bolger-level intelligence would do. Is Mephisto a male Bolger-level intelligence? Strange considered this with the particular care of someone who rarely needed to consider anything carefully. Yes, he said. He is. Rogers stood, the room oriented toward him with the unconscious collective attention that his presence consistently produced, the gravity of someone people had learned to follow when following became necessary. Then we have two problems operating on converging timelines, he said. AIM needs to be stopped before they attempt synthesis, and Mephisto needs to be prevented from using the resulting situation for territorial expansion. He looked at Spawn. Can you track the necroplasm signature that AIM is using as their research baseline? Yes. You help Strange understand the dimensional framework well enough to construct a containment protocol if AIM's attempt proceeds further than we'd like. A pause. Possibly. Will you? The chains moved slowly. The cold green fire in Spawn's eyes was steady and unreadable. Al Simmons, who had come to this universe through no choice of his own, who had spent a night in a holding room calculating exit options he had not used, who had watched a blind lawyer walk into that room with no weapon and no certainty and no agenda beyond what was right, looked at Steve Rogers and made a decision. Yes, he said. Natasha, who had been wrong about him once and did not intend to be wrong about him twice, made a note. Thor, who had been watching the entire exchange with the patient attention of someone taking a long measurement, nodded once with the finality of a verdict. And in a building in the Midwest, beneath 17 levels of subterranean laboratory space, an AIM researcher looked at her synthesis readings and made a note in her log that the necroplasm composition was stabilizing faster than projected. 8 weeks suddenly felt optimistic. The AIM facility existed, officially, as an agricultural research complex in rural Kansas. It was a good cover. The kind that worked not because it was convincing under scrutiny, but because it discouraged scrutiny entirely. Flat land, grain silos, an access road that appeared on county maps as a private agricultural easement, and a perimeter fence that looked like standard livestock containment and contained, beneath its unremarkable exterior, enough current to stop a rhinoceros. Underground, 17 levels down, it was something else entirely. Dr. Monica Rappaccini had spent 14 months building something she believed would change the relationship between human science and supernatural energy permanently. She was brilliant in the specific way that made her dangerous, not the brilliance that recognized limits, but the brilliance that recognized limits and chose to interpret them as temporary obstacles rather than fundamental constraints. She had looked at the necroplasm readings from the Manhattan incident with the focused hunger of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of data without knowing what form it would take. She had not slept in 36 hours. The synthesis chamber on level 17 was the size of a cathedral and smelled of ozone, and something underneath the ozone that her instruments registered, but her brain declined to fully process. An olfactory category her neurology had no existing file for. The central containment array had taken 8 months to build and represented the combined effort of 43 researchers, 11 of whom had subsequently requested reassignment, and 2 of whom had not been seen since the 3rd month of testing. She told herself those 2 had transferred voluntarily. She had gotten good at telling herself things. The synthesis readings on her primary display were, by every metric she had established, perfect. The composition profile from the Manhattan readings had given her a baseline she could not have generated independently in less than 5 years. She had compressed that timeline to 14 months through methods that her funding sources had approved without fully understanding, which was how most significant science got done. What she had not accounted for, because she had not had the data to account for it, was that the necroplasm composition was not stable in the way laboratory substances were stable. It was stable in the way a living thing is stable, through constant active maintenance, through the ongoing expenditure of energy from its source framework. Synthetic necroplasm, absent that source framework, was not a contained substance, it was a signal. And something had been listening to it for 6 weeks. The Quinjet crossed into Kansas airspace at altitude that kept it below civilian radar and above agricultural drone traffic, which was a window of approximately 400 feet that Stark had identified with the particular satisfaction of someone who finds problems more interesting than answers. Rogers had the tactical layout on his display. Strange sat with his eyes closed and his hands open on his knees, maintaining a monitoring spell that had been running continuously for 18 hours, and was giving him readings he described as deeply concerning with the flatness of someone conserving alarm for situations that warranted it more. Natasha reviewed the facility schematics that a shield extraction team had obtained 3 days earlier through methods that did not appear in the official mission brief. Spawn sat at the rear of the jet and said nothing. He had said very little since the meeting. Not withdrawal exactly, more the quality of attention that comes before action, the way a system powers down non-essential functions when it needs maximum capacity elsewhere. Murdoch had noticed it and said nothing, which was the correct response. Thor had noticed it and moved to sit beside him, which was unexpected. "You have fought this kind of battle before," Thor said, not a question. "Different names." Same shape. Spawn looked at the farmland scrolling past below. Someone builds something they don't understand, something answers. People get hurt who had nothing to do with building it. You were the one who addressed the consequences, usually after it was too late to prevent them. Thor was quiet for a moment with the particular quality of silence that belonged to someone who had also arrived too late more than once and carried the specific weight of that. "In Asgard," Thor said, "we have a concept. Arriving in time is a matter of power. Arriving before it matters is a matter of wisdom." He paused. "I have spent considerable time learning the difference." Spawn looked at him. It was not a long look, and it did not resolve into anything as simple as warmth. But there was something in it that registered Thor's words as having landed somewhere real rather than deflecting off the exterior. "We are early this time," Spawn said. "Yes," Thor agreed. "Let us ensure it counts." The facility's perimeter response was faster than the schematics suggested, which meant someone had upgraded their systems in the past 72 hours. The first response team that emerged from the grain silo access points was not standard AIM security, yellow jumpsuited researchers with energy weapons. These were something different, tactical operators in dark equipment, carrying weapons that Strange's monitoring spell immediately flagged as incorporating necroplasm-derived energy sources. They had been testing faster than the intelligence suggested. Natasha adjusted the mission parameters in real time with the focused pragmatism of someone who plans for plans failing. "They've weaponized a partial synthesis. The readings are unstable but functional." Functional meaning what? Rogers said. Meaning those weapons will do something. Whether it's what AIM intends is a different question. First weapon discharged toward Rogers and produced an effect that no one in the field had a prepared response for. The energy it released was not a beam or a concussive blast. It was a tearing, a localized dimensional stress that opened a hairline fracture in the air approximately 6 inches from Rogers' shield, and emitted from that fracture sound that did not belong to any frequency in normal human experience. Rogers' shield held. Rogers staggered. Strange sealed the fracture in the same motion he used to neutralize the weapon's operator, the sling ring moving with the efficiency of absolute familiarity. They've partially replicated the dimensional interface function, Strange called out. His voice had the particular tension of controlled urgency. The weapons are creating micro-apertures. They're unstable. If more than 3 discharge simultaneously in proximity, the apertures could merge. Into what? Natasha said. Into something significantly larger than micro. Chains moved. Spawn went through the facility's external security with a directness that was not brutality, but was several categories beyond efficiency. The necroplasm responded to the synthetic necroplasm signatures in the weapons with something that was functionally recognition, the way our immune system responds to a foreign agent, actively and with prejudice. The chains did not destroy the weapons. They consumed them, drawing the unstable synthetic necroplasm back into the suit with a sound like wind reversing direction, leaving the operators holding inert casings. It was Thor who cleared the above-ground perimeter, moving with a directness that leveled 3 security positions simultaneously and created the kind of decisive opening that tactical planning aims for and rarely achieves so cleanly. Lightning did not discriminate between natural and supernatural energy sources, which turned out to be a significant tactical advantage. Natasha was already inside through an access point that had not appeared on the schematics because it was not technically a designed access point. She had made it one. Rogers followed at a pace that balanced speed with the awareness that the situation underground was likely to be considerably more complicated than the surface. He was correct. Level 17 looked different from the facility schematics. Rappaccini had modified the synthesis chamber in the final weeks, expanding the containment array outward to accommodate readings she had not anticipated and had chosen to accommodate rather than report. The chamber was now 3 times its original footprint, and the central synthesis column, which should have contained a stable field of synthetic necroplasm awaiting controlled testing, was doing something that none of her instruments had a display setting for. It was breathing, not literally, but the field pulsed with a rhythm that mapped to no mechanical or electrical cycle in the chamber, a deep and patient rhythm that had started 6 days ago and had been getting stronger every 12 hours since. Rappaccini stood at her primary display looking at readings that told her, in the precise language of instruments she had built and calibrated herself, that she had not synthesized necroplasm, she had synthesized a call, and something had been responding to it for 6 days, getting closer with each pulse, pressing against the dimensional barrier from the other side with the patient, escalating pressure of something very large leaning against a door. She had not stopped the synthesis because she had told herself, right up until approximately 30 seconds ago, that the readings were within acceptable parameters. Standing in level 17 watching the containment field develop visible fracture lines, she understood that she had been catastrophically wrong about what acceptable parameters meant in the context of interdimensional metaphysics. The Avengers came through the access shaft in a sequence that reflected their individual approaches to entering unknown hostile situations. Natasha first, assessment complete before she landed. Rogers second, shield up, reading the room in a single sweep. Strange through a portal that opened directly adjacent to the synthesis column, his monitoring spell already extending into the chamber's energy field. Thor through the ceiling, because Thor found ceiling access points operationally straightforward. Spawn came through the wall, The necroplasm hit the chamber's synthetic field like a tuning fork hitting its matching frequency. The suit expanded involuntarily, the chains snapping outward to their full extension, every surface of the necroplasm pulsing with a light that was not light, a darkness that was actively dark in a way that displaced the chamber's fluorescent lighting by sheer categorical priority. Spawn stopped, stood very still. "It's already here," he said. Rogers heard something in those three words that tightened everything. What's already here? The thing that was listening. Spawn's voice had dropped to a register that carried below hearing into something felt in the chest. "It's been pressing against your dimensional barrier for 6 days. The synthetic necroplasm was broadcasting a frequency it recognized as a structural weakness, a way in." He looked at the fracture lines in the containment field. "It hasn't breached yet. It's being careful. Testing the edges. Can we stop it?" Strange said. He was already working, the sling ring moving through patterns that his monitoring spell had been building toward for 18 hours. A containment protocol assembled from everything Spawn had taught him about necroplasm's actual metaphysical function. "We can close the door," Spawn said. "But closing it from this side means the synthetic necroplasm has to be neutralized completely. Not contained, neutralized. It's broadcasting continuously. As long as any of it exists in an active state, the signal continues. The thing on the other side keeps pressing," Rogers said. "It finds a way through." "Yes." Rappaccini had backed against the far wall with the expression of someone watching the consequences of their choices arrive in physical form. She was still holding her tablet. Her instruments were still recording. Some part of her brain was still functioning as a scientist, even as every other part processed what her science had produced. "I can initiate a controlled collapse of the synthesis array," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. "It will destroy 14 months of research. It will destroy more than that if you don't," Natasha said. "I know." Rappaccini looked at her tablet, looked at the fracture lines, looked at the thing pressing against the barrier from the other side, visible now as a displacement in the field's surface, the outline of something vast and patient testing the membrane between its dimension and theirs. "I know." She moved to the primary control interface. What happened next happened in a sequence that was simultaneously too fast and too deliberate, the kind of moment that afterwards everyone present would describe differently because they had all been watching different parts of it. Rappaccini initiated the collapse sequence. The synthesis array began shutting down in cascading sections from the outer ring inward. The field's pulse slowed. The fracture lines stabilized, stopped spreading. And the thing on the other side, feeling the signal beginning to fade, stopped being patient. It hit the barrier with everything it had. The containment field shattered, not the dimensional barrier. The containment field, the physical structure AIM had built to house their synthesis experiment, which turned out to be considerably less robust than the dimensional membrane it had been pressing against. The chamber's outer ring collapsed inward. 3 of Rappaccini's researchers who had been at their stations were thrown clear by Strange's shield spell, which he had deployed the moment the fracture lines changed pattern. The synthesis column cracked from base to apex, and from the crack, for exactly 4 seconds, something looked through. It was not a face. It was not a shape. It was a quality of attention, the specific and absolute focus of an intelligence that operated at a scale that made the concept of individual perception almost meaningless. Turning toward the aperture it had made and assessing what lay beyond it, Spawn stepped between it and the room. The necroplasm expanded to its absolute maximum, the suit becoming something vast and dark and deeply, fundamentally present in a way that pushed against the edges of the chamber's physical space. The chains extended to the synthesis column's crack and wrapped it, not blocking the aperture but gripping the edges of it, holding it in a specific shape. Spawn held a dimensional aperture closed with his bare hands. The chains burned. The necroplasm burned. The cold green fire in his eyes went white. "Strange," he said through something that was not quite a voice. Now, Strange's containment protocol released. It was the most complex piece of applied metaphysics Stephen Strange had assembled in real time under combat conditions, which was a category with significant prior entries. It used everything Spawn had taught him about necroplasm's actual function, not as energy but as binding, not as power but as connection, and turned that understanding into a seal that addressed the aperture's fundamental nature rather than its physical manifestation. It worked because Spawn was holding the edges still. It cost him. The aperture closed. The synthetic necroplasm in the collapsed array went inert simultaneously. Every active particle neutralizing as Strange's protocol removed the dimensional interface function that had made it a signal rather than a substance. The chamber's atmosphere normalized. The thing on the other side of the barrier withdrew slowly, with the particular quality of withdrawal that was not defeat but recalibration. It would find another way. Eventually, but not today. Spawn released the synthesis column and the chains retracted, and he stood in the collapsed chamber breathing with the specific difficulty of someone whose breathing was not entirely a biological function, and who had just spent reserves that did not refill quickly. Thor was beside him before he reached the floor, one hand at his shoulder, the support of someone with the strength to actually provide it. "Yield for a moment," Thor said. "The battle is done." "Battles are never done," Spawn said. But he did not pull away. Rogers looked at the sealed aperture, at the inert synthesis array, at Rappaccini, who was still holding her tablet with the expression of someone who had just had a very thorough education. "Give S.H.I.E.L.D. everything," he said to her. "Every file, every reading, every synthesis record." She said it without hesitation, which meant the experience had been sufficient. "Yes, I will." Natasha was already on comms arranging the facility's containment, the kind of quiet and total administrative competence that ensured by the time any official inquiry arrived the situation would be documented, secured, and categorized in a way that protected the mission's operational details. Strange crouched beside the sealed aperture and examined his containment protocol with the analytical attention of someone reading their own work critically. "Seal will hold," he said. 6 to 8 months. After that, the dimensional stress will begin degrading it, meaning we have 6 to 8 months to develop something permanent, Rogers said. "Meaning we have 6 to 8 months. Strange looked up. "I'll need Simmons' cooperation to develop something permanent. The protocol works because of what I learned from him. Improving it requires more of the same." Everyone looked at Spawn, who was standing mostly upright now with Thor's hand still at his shoulder, and the chains settled, and the cold green fire back to its normal temperature. Al Simmons looked at the sealed aperture, looked at the chamber, looked at the people who had come underground with him without a complete plan and without certainty, and without anything more than the reasonable conviction that the alternative was worse, people he had known for 4 days. He thought about Wanda, which he tried not to do because it led nowhere he could afford to go. He thought about his city, his dark and damaged and irreplaceable city, which existed in a dimension he currently had no way to reach. He thought about what Murdoch had said in the holding room about finding something worth doing. 6 months, he said. "I'll give you 6 months." It was not a promise of belonging. It was not an acceptance of this world as his own. It was something more honest than either of those things. A pragmatic commitment from a man who had learned that pragmatic commitments were the ones that actually held. Thor released his shoulder. Natasha noted the timeline on her comms. Strange returned to his examination of the seal. Rogers looked at Spawn with the expression he wore when something confirmed what he had decided to believe about a person. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Above Kansas, the sky was entirely ordinary. Flat and grey and October cold, offering nothing dramatic. The kind of sky that most people drove under without looking at. Below it, 17 levels down, the door between worlds held, for now. Mephisto made his move on a Tuesday. It was, in retrospect, exactly the kind of detail that should have been a warning. Mephisto did not operate on Tuesday. He operated on the edges of moments, in the spaces between decisions, in the specific vulnerability of people who had just survived something difficult and had not yet recovered their full capacity for vigilance. The AIM facility had been contained 6 days ago. The team was debriefing, recovering, planning. Strange was deep in the permanent seal protocol. Spawn was working with him 18 hours a day, translating necroplasm metaphysics into frameworks Strange could apply. Tuesday was, by every operational metric, the worst possible day to be attacked. which was precisely why Mephisto chose it. He did not appear in person. That was the second detail that mattered. What appeared instead, simultaneously, in 7 locations across Manhattan were constructs. Not illusions exactly, something with more physical presence than illusion, but less autonomous function than a summoned entity. They were dressed in Spawn's colors, black and red, and they wore approximations of the necroplasm suit that were close enough to read as genuine on any sensor array not specifically calibrated to the original. They began destroying things, not randomly, with the specific, curated selection of targets that communicated authorship to anyone paying attention. A shield relay station, a courthouse where 3 organized crime cases were in active trial, a community center in Hell's Kitchen that Murdoch had been quietly associated with for 6 years, a children's hospital in Midtown that had no strategic value whatsoever and whose selection was therefore the most deliberate choice of all. They moved and fought with a version of Spawn's abilities, imprecise but recognizable, and they left behind physical evidence, chain marks, necroplasm residue of a synthetic variant that had been carefully constructed to match Spawn's signature at the resolution level of standard shield analysis. The news cycle turned in 11 minutes. Spawn felt it before he saw it. The synthetic necroplasm resonated with his own the way a bad note resonates with a tuned string, not harmony but dissonance, an active wrongness that climbed through the suit and arrived in his awareness as something between nausea and fury. He was on level 3 of the sanctum, working through a metaphysical translation with Strange, when the constructs activated and the resonance hit him like a change in air pressure. Strange felt it differently. His monitoring spell, which had been running continuously since the AIM facility, registered the 7 locations simultaneously and produced a threat assessment that he read in the time it took most people to register that something had changed. 7 constructs, Strange said. Necroplasm derived, Mephisto's architecture beneath the surface. I know. Spawn was already moving toward the sanctum's exit. He's making me the problem. He's making you the crisis that requires his solution, Strange said, keeping pace. There's a distinction. If you are simply a problem, the Avengers contain you. If you are a crisis, Mephisto positions himself as the entity with the authority and capability to resolve it, which requires the relevant parties to grant him expanded jurisdictional recognition. If they grant him that recognition to stop a crisis I supposedly caused, he achieves in one Tuesday what he has been working toward for considerably longer. Strange opened a portal. The constructs are secondary. The narrative is the weapon. They came through the portal into a Manhattan that was operating at the specific frequency of a city that has absorbed enough catastrophe to recognize the signs of more and has not yet decided whether to panic. Sirens in multiple directions. News drones clustering above the courthouse, 3 blocks north. Emergency services moving with the controlled urgency of people, following protocols designed for situations that protocols cannot fully address. Murdoch was already on comms. He had been in the kitchen when the community center construct attacked and had engaged it directly, which had given him 6 minutes of close-quarters assessment that his other senses were considerably better suited to than camera footage. Not him, Murdoch said through the comm. His voice had the particular quality of someone fighting and talking simultaneously, the words arriving in the gaps between physical effort. The heartbeat is wrong. The second rhythm is wrong. It's a copy, but it's not accurate. You prove that to cameras, Natasha said, a pause that contained a significant amount of information. Not easily. Then it doesn't matter yet, she said. Contain first, narrative second. Rogers had the tactical overlay running and was deploying in the pattern he used when the operational situation required simultaneous response across multiple locations, which required splitting resources in a way he found philosophically uncomfortable but tactically necessary. Thor had the Midtown Hospital construct, which was correct because Thor's presence communicated protective intent in a way that cameras could read clearly, the right optic for the most emotionally charged location. Natasha had the shield relay station, which required the least visible heroism and the most precise work. Banner was on standby in a location chosen for maximum response radius and minimum collateral risk, which was the kind of careful preparation that meant he was already aware he might be needed and was managing the awareness with practiced focus. Stark had 3 constructs simultaneously, because Stark had built his armor specifically for this kind of distributed engagement, and because his presence with cameras running produced a specific kind of public reassurance that was itself a tactical resource. Spawn and Strange took the courthouse. The courthouse construct had done approximately $4 million of structural damage, and was in the process of doing considerably more when Spawn came through the building's facade at a velocity that communicated priority. The construct turned toward him with the borrowed physicality of Mephisto's careful construction, moving with a version of his speed that was close enough to be insulting and wrong enough to be enraging. Spawn did not engage it immediately. He stopped, stood, looked at it with the focused assessment of someone reading a text they have seen before in a different language. He built this from the plaza readings, he said to Strange, who had portaled in at the far end of the courtroom and was already beginning the metaphysical analysis that would provide the construct's structural weaknesses. The composition, the movement patterns, the chain behavior, everything he used came from what the sensors recorded when I arrived. Which means it's accurate to your public performance, Strange said, not to your actual capability. And not to the things the sensors couldn't measure. Spawn raised his right hand. The necroplasm on his palm darkened and then opened, a controlled aperture in the suit's surface that exposed something beneath it, not flesh, not machinery, something that operated in a category that Strange's monitoring spell registered as a direct interface with the necroplasm source framework. The thing that Malebolger had built into the suit not as a weapon but as a leash, the direct connection between Al Simmons and the dimension of his damnation. It was the thing Spawn never used willingly. The thing he kept controlled and contained because using it meant drawing on the source framework directly, which meant Malebolger could feel it, could reach back along the connection, could attempt to reassert the control he had designed into the necroplasm from the beginning. Using it here meant letting his maker know exactly where he was. He used it anyway. The necroplasm construct across the courtroom responded to the source framework signal the way all synthetic necroplasm responded, with recognition and then with dissolution, the artificial binding that held it together unwinding in the presence of the genuine article. It came apart not explosively but thoroughly, the chains losing coherence first, then the suit, then the physical form beneath until what remained was a residue of synthetic necroplasm on the courthouse floor that Strange immediately sealed with a containment protocol. 6 seconds. That will work on all 7, Strange said. Yes, Spawn closed his hand, the aperture sealed. It will also tell Malebolger where I am. Strange looked at him steadily. Will that be a problem? Malebolger is not going to cross dimensional barriers to retrieve one asset. He doesn't value me that way. Spawn looked at the necroplasm residue, but he'll know, and knowing will change his calculations about what I'm doing here and whether it serves his purposes. Does it serve his purposes? Not in any way he would recognize as useful. A pause. Not yet. They went through 5 more constructs in 12 minutes. The pattern was the same each time. Spawn using the source framework interface to dissolve the synthetic binding, Strange immediately sealing the residue to prevent reactivation. The work was fast and complete, and left behind no ambiguity about the construct's artificial nature, which was the narrative component that Natasha had identified as the second priority. The 7th construct was at the community center in Hell's Kitchen. Murdoch had already engaged it, and had been engaging it for 9 minutes, which was longer than the fight should have lasted and shorter than it would have lasted without his specific and intimate knowledge of the building's layout. He had kept it contained to the upper floor, away from the after-school program still in the basement, through a combination of tactical precision and personal ferocity that had more to do with what the building represented to him than with any calculated strategy. Spawn came through the stairwell door and stopped. Murdoch was bleeding from a cut above his ear that the construct's chain approximation had opened, still moving with the fluid economy of someone who had trained every instinct specifically for close-quarters work against enhanced opponents, keeping the construct's attention fragmented between defense and offense in a way that prevented it from applying its full capability to either. He was buying time. He was very good at it. Spawn watched for exactly 2 seconds, reading the construct's pattern, its weight distribution, the slight asymmetry in how it managed the chain approximations that indicated where Mephisto's construction had been least precise. Then he ended it. The source framework interface opened for the 7th time. The construct dissolved. The residue fell. Murdoch stood in the empty room, breathing with the controlled rhythm of someone bringing their system back from a high-demand state. He touched the cut above his ear with 2 fingers, assessed it, and concluded it was not a problem. 7, he said. 7, Spawn confirmed. Murdoch turned toward him with the uncanny accuracy of navigation that had nothing to do with sight. You used something when you dissolved them. I could hear the difference in your second heartbeat when you did it. Costly, Spawn considered the question with the honesty it deserved. It had consequences, not immediately, potentially later. Doc nodded, the nod of someone who understood that category of answer from the inside. Thank you, he said, for this building. It was not a small thing, and Murdoch did not say it as a small thing. He said it with the directness of someone who spent most of their life in the necessary performance of being someone else, and who reserved directness for moments that required it. Spawn looked at the room. At the ceiling where the construct's chain approximation had left marks that were not his marks. At the floor where children had been sitting an hour ago. At the man standing in it bleeding from a cut above his ear, having fought something designed to destroy him for 9 minutes to keep those children safe. It's a good building, Spawn said. Mephisto appeared at 6 in the evening, not in a dramatic location. In the Sanctum Sanctorum's front room, sitting in the same chair as before, which Spawn recognized as a deliberate callback and filed as information about how Mephisto's psychology operated. He was not alone this time. Behind him, barely visible in the room's low light, were 2 entities that Strange's monitoring spell registered as significant supernatural presences, not Mephisto's constructs but independent powers, witnesses in the technical supernatural legal sense. He had brought documentation. 7 incidents, Mephisto said before anyone spoke, attributed to your necroplasm signature in every initial report. 7 locations of cultural, legal, and symbolic significance. 1 children's hospital. He looked at Spawn with the expression of someone presenting evidence rather than accusations. The public narrative as it currently stands is that you are a threat that the Avengers failed to contain. The constructs were yours, Strange said. They were constructed from publicly available sensor data. Anyone could have built them. Mephisto's tone remained conversational. The relevant question is not who built them, but what the existing supernatural frameworks require in response to a dimensional anomaly that has now been associated with 7 significant incidents. He produced a document that existed simultaneously in physical and metaphysical space, its edges slightly out of phase with the room's reality. Under the agreements governing supernatural territorial authority in this dimension, an anomalous entity whose activities have caused crisis-level incidents requires classification under an existing authority's jurisdiction. He set the document on the table. I am prepared to accept jurisdictional responsibility for Simmons, to classify him, contain him appropriately, and ensure his activities do not continue to destabilize this dimension's supernatural order. 2 witnesses behind him observed without expression. Spawn looked at the document, at Mephisto, at the witnesses. He read the architecture of the situation the way he read everything, completely and without the comfort of pretending it was simpler than it was. Been building to this since I arrived, he said. Since before you arrived, technically. The moment your necroplasm signature appeared in our dimensional framework, I began preparing for this conversation. Mephisto's tone carried no particular shame about this. I am not your enemy, Simmons. I am a power with responsibilities that require this dimension's supernatural order to function predictably. You represent an unpredictable variable. This is the most efficient resolution. Efficient for you, everyone. Under my jurisdiction, you would have protection, resources, and defined operational parameters. You would not be stateless. You would not be anomalous. You would have a place. He paused. Isn't that what you want? Was a good question. Mephisto asked good questions, had been asking them for longer than most civilizations, and he asked this one with the specific knowledge that it targeted something real. Al Simmons had wanted a place for a long time, had wanted to belong somewhere that did not require him to be something other than what he was, had watched that won't be exploited by Malebolger and had learned at extraordinary cost what it meant to trade belonging for captivity. No, Spawn said. Mephisto's expression did not change. Then what do you want? To make my own choices, about what I do, who I help, what I fight. Spawn's voice was entirely level. The same thing I wanted in my own dimension. The same thing your equivalent there spent years trying to take from me. He looked at the document. I know what jurisdiction means when a being like you offers it. I've read that contract before. The terms here would be considerably more. No, Spawn said again. The chains rose around him, not aggressively but with the absolute finality of a man who has found the edge of what he will negotiate. You built 7 constructs of me and sent them to destroy a children's hospital to manufacture a crisis that required your solution. I'm not signing anything you wrote. Room was very quiet. Strange stepped forward. He was holding the containment seal he had been building for 6 days, the permanent protocol derived from everything Spawn had taught him, compressed into a metaphysical document that occupied the same supernatural legal space as Mephisto's jurisdiction claim. Alternative classification, Strange said. He set his document on the table beside Mephisto's. Simmons is classified as an independent supernatural entity operating under Sanctum Sanctorum's observational framework. Not jurisdictional authority, observational. He retains full autonomy. His activities are documented and his dimensional signature is registered within our framework, which addresses the jurisdictional anomaly concern without requiring him to be subject to any existing power's authority. Mephisto looked at the document. Read it with the speed of someone who had been reading supernatural legal instruments for a very long time. This does not give you control over him, he said. No, Strange agreed. It gives him a defined status, which is what you claim to need. If your concern was genuinely about jurisdictional clarity rather than acquisition, this resolves it. 2 witnesses behind Mephisto observed the document with the careful attention of their function. One of them made a notation in something that was not quite a book. Mephisto sat with the stillness of someone running calculations at a depth that did not show on the surface. The constructs had failed because Spawn had used the source framework interface, which had dissolved them in a way that made their artificial nature evidentially clear. The narrative had not held. The crisis had not materialized in the form he needed. And Strange had produced a classification instrument that addressed the legitimate concern with enough technical precision to satisfy the witnesses. He had been outmaneuvered, not entirely. There were longer games still in play, threads that this resolution did not close, possibilities that an independent supernatural entity with necroplasm-based power operating freely in his dimension represented for calculations he had been running for considerably longer than anyone in this room understood. Patience was not a virtue Mephisto practiced. It was a nature he had developed over time, the fundamental recognition that most things that mattered required longer than any individual moment to resolve. He would wait. He picked up his document, folded it with precise, unhurried care. Observational classification is acceptable, he said. For now, he stood. The witnesses withdrew. The sanctum's front door opened without being touched. Mephisto paused in the doorway without turning, the same position as his previous departure, and Spawn recognized this too as deliberate, the callback that communicated that the pattern was still his even when the outcome was not. You made an interesting choice today, Mephisto said. Using the source framework interface. Malebolger felt it. I know, Spawn said. He will draw conclusions. Always does. Some of those conclusions, Mephisto said with the specific care of someone placing a weight on a scale, may bring things through the dimensional barrier that make what AIM attempted look like a minor inconvenience. He stepped through the door, something to consider during your observational period. Door closed, Strange looked at Spawn. Spawn looked at the door. Murdoch, from the corner where he had been present and silent throughout the entire exchange, spoke first. "He's not wrong about Mailbolger," he said. "No," Spawn said, "he's not." Rogers, who had arrived midway through the confrontation and had said nothing, which was its own form of operational wisdom, looked at the classification document Strange had placed on the table. "Is it real?" he asked Strange. "The classification, does it actually work? Addresses the legitimate metaphysical concern. Mephisto's witnesses will register it in the appropriate frameworks. Spawn has a defined status in our supernatural order that is not subject to any existing power's jurisdiction." Strange looked at Spawn. "It is as real as we make it." Spawn looked at the document. At his name in Strange's precise handwriting, the name Al Simmons in a register of entities that existed independently of every hierarchy in this dimension. Not owned, not classified as threat or asset or weapon or curiosity. Independent, it was a small thing. It was also the thing that mattered most. "It's real," he said. Outside the sanctum, Manhattan continued. The news cycle was already turning, camera footage of the construct's dissolution providing evidence of their artificial composition. Stark's public statement framing the incident as an attempted manipulation of public perception by unknown parties. The narrative was not entirely resolved. It would not be entirely resolved for weeks. But it had been redirected from the shape Mephisto had built for it. Somewhere in a dimension that operated by different rules under a different sky, Mailbolger sat with the specific knowledge that his most troublesome creation had used the source framework interface in a dimension he had not known it could reach, and drew from that knowledge conclusions that would take time to fully develop into action. The clock that had been running since Spawn's arrival through the dimensional rift above Manhattan continued. But the immediate crisis had passed, and Al Simmons, for the first time since a portal had deposited him in a world that was not his own, stood in a room with people who had fought beside him and a document that said he existed on his own terms, and felt something he had not felt in longer than he could accurately remember, not peace. Nothing as simple or as fragile as that, something more like ground beneath his feet. The weeks after Mephisto's departure had a quality that Spawn recognized from his own world, the specific texture of aftermath. Not peace, never quite peace, but the functional calm of a situation that has resolved its immediate crisis and has not yet generated its next one. The city moved at its normal frequency. S.H.I.E.L.D. filed its reports. Strange worked on the permanent seal protocol with the focused intensity of someone who understood that 6 months was a deadline rather than a guideline. The Avengers returned to the ordinary extraordinary business of being the Avengers. Spawn moved through it all like something the city had not yet decided what to do with. He was not living in the sanctum, exactly. He occupied a space in its lower levels that Strange had designated as available without making a formal offer, which was the kind of diplomatic precision that Spawn had come to recognize as characteristic of the man. Not invitation, availability. The distinction mattered because it preserved autonomy on both sides, which was the condition under which Spawn could accept anything at all. He spent his days between the sanctum and the streets, Hell's Kitchen mostly. Murdoch's territory, with Murdoch's tacit acknowledgement that tacit acknowledgement was all that would ever be offered or required. They did not patrol together formally. They occupied the same geography with the same intentions, and occasionally found themselves at the same problem simultaneously, which produced results that neither of them would have achieved as efficiently alone. It was a partnership in the specific sense that neither of them would have called it that, which was the only kind either of them knew how to sustain. The streets responded to his presence, the way streets respond to anything consistent. Initially with alarm, then with the cautious recalibration of people who have learned that a frightening thing is predictable, and predictable frightening things are considerably less dangerous than unpredictable ones. Then, slowly, with something that was not quite acceptance but was adjacent to it. The particular acknowledgement of communities that have always depended on things that operate outside official protection, that have learned to recognize a specific quality of intent beneath a frightening exterior. He was Al Simmons once, a man from a neighborhood not unlike this one, before everything else. That did not go away. The official recognition came on a Thursday morning, in a conference room at the Avengers facility that had been chosen for its neutrality, which meant it was the room nobody used for anything important, and therefore carried no political weight in any direction. Maria Hill ran the meeting with the precise efficiency she brought to everything, which meant it lasted 22 minutes, and produced a document that nobody was entirely happy with, and everybody could functionally accept, which was her definition of a successful outcome. The document designated Spawn as an independent consultant to the Avengers Supernatural Response Division, a category that had not previously existed and had been created specifically to accommodate a situation that no existing category addressed. It gave him operational access to S.H.I.E.L.'s supernatural intelligence database, which Strange had negotiated as a practical necessity for the permanent SEAL protocol work. It gave the Avengers no authority over his activities whatsoever, which Natasha had argued against, and Rogers had quietly supported, and which had ultimately prevailed because the alternative was a relationship built on a fiction that would collapse at the first moment of genuine conflict. It also, in a subsection that Hill had drafted herself, and which she considered the most important component, established a communication protocol. Not surveillance, not oversight. A specific and limited mechanism of two parties agreeing to tell each other things that were relevant to each other's operations, which was the foundation of functional professional relationships, and which was the most that could be honestly offered. Spawn read the document in the conference room with the focused attention of someone who had read contracts with supernatural entities, and understood the difference between what words said and what they meant. He signed it, not because it gave him anything he needed, because it represented the most honest instrument anyone in this dimension had offered him, a framework that acknowledged what he was rather than attempting to define it into something more manageable. Hill took the signed document with the expression of someone who had expected this to be harder. "Welcome to the team," she said, in the tone of someone for whom the phrase was administrative rather than sentimental. "Not on the team," Spawn said. "No," she agreed, "but you're in the framework." Which is what matters operationally. It was, Spawn decided, the most accurate thing anyone in an official capacity had said to him since he arrived. Thor found him on the Sanctum roof 3 days later. This was notable because the Sanctum roof required either flight or a specific knowledge of the building's internal access points, and Thor had used neither. He had simply arrived, the way Asgardians occasionally arrived at places when they had decided to be somewhere, and the intervening distance was not particularly relevant to that decision. He sat beside Spawn on the roof's edge with the ease of someone entirely comfortable with heights, and looked at the city with the particular attention of someone who has seen many cities across many realms, and has learned to appreciate what is specific about each one. "You are thinking about going back," Thor said. Spawn did not ask how he knew. "I'm thinking about whether going back is possible. Strange believes the dimensional barrier will stabilize sufficiently for a controlled crossing in 4 to 6 months. The permanent SEAL protocol, once completed, will provide the metaphysical framework for a two-way transit." Thor paused. "He did not tell you this. Told me the SEAL would hold. He didn't tell me what else it would enable. Was being careful. He did not want to offer you something before he was certain he could deliver it." Thor looked at the skyline. "He is in most things careful." Spawn was quiet for a moment. Manhattan spread below them in its particular density of light and motion, the constant productive noise of a city that did not stop for anything, which was one of the things he recognized in it from his own version. "If I go back," he said, "there's a version of this that means I was never here. That everything that happened in the past weeks was an interruption. That I return to my world and this one continues without me, and nothing is permanently different. That version is not accurate," Thor said simply. I know. The supernatural order of this dimension has been altered. Mephisto's jurisdictional claim was defeated not by force, but by the instrument Strange built from what you taught him. AIM's research has been contained and their data destroyed. The dimensional barrier has been reinforced in ways that will make future incursion of the kind they attempted considerably more difficult. Thor looked at him. These things do not unhappen when you leave. What about the thing Mephisto mentioned? Malebolger's conclusions. Question that had been present since Mephisto's departure, running beneath everything else like the second heartbeat Murdoch could hear. The knowledge that using the source framework interface had sent a signal to his maker, and that his maker was not the kind of intelligence that ignored signals. Thor considered this with the gravity it deserved. Strange believes the dimensional barrier reinforcement will complicate any attempt by external entities to act on those conclusions directly. The permanent seal was designed with that specific concern in mind. He paused. It will not prevent the attempt indefinitely. Spawn agreed. It won't. Then perhaps the question is not whether Malebolger's conclusions create a future problem, Thor said, but whether the people who would face that problem are better prepared for it than they were before you arrived. Spawn looked at the city. The chains coiled slowly in their meditative rhythm, and the necroplasm suit was quiet against the October air, and the cold green fire in his eyes was steady and unreadable as it always was. And Al Simmons thought about the specific arithmetic of what his presence in this world had cost, and what it had produced. A children's hospital that was still standing. A community center in Hell's Kitchen with chain marks on the ceiling that would be painted over, and that Murdoch would know were there and that Spawn would know were there, which was a kind of shared history. A classification document that said he existed on his own terms. A seal on a dimensional barrier that would hold for 6 months, and then, if Strange's permanent protocol worked, considerably longer. A blind lawyer who had walked into a holding room with no weapon and no certainty, and had offered to be his lawyer, which remained one of the stranger and more honest things anyone had ever done for him. You came up here for a reason, Spawn said. I came to tell you something before Strange tells you the transit possibility formally, Thor said. Because when Strange tells you formally, there will be a conversation about timelines and protocols and the practical requirements of the crossing. It will be a necessary conversation. It will not have room for the simpler thing, which is... Thor looked at him directly with the particular quality of attention that was the most honest thing about him, the gaze of someone who did not perform concern but experienced it. That you are welcome to return, he said, if you choose to, when the time comes. That the framework Hill created has space for someone who moves between dimensions, and that the people in it would not find your return an imposition. He paused. I have lived between worlds for a long time. I know what it costs to not have a place that holds your absence as well as your presence. Spawn was quiet for a long moment. The city moved below them. Somewhere in Hell's Kitchen a siren rose and fell. A news drone crossed at altitude, lights blinking in their regulatory pattern, indifferent to the two figures on the sanctum roof having a conversation that the city's noise absorbed entirely. Think about it, Spawn said. It was not a commitment. It was not a refusal. It was the most honest answer available, which was the only kind worth giving. Thor nodded as though this was sufficient, because for him it was. Murdoch came to the sanctum, the night before Strange was scheduled to present the permanent seal protocol, which was also the night before the formal conversation about transit possibility, which meant it was the night before everything that came next began to take its shape. He came without calling ahead, which meant he had known Spawn would be there, and had decided that calling ahead would make the conversation something it didn't need to be. He sat in the chair he had used in the holding room, which Strange had, without comment, placed in the lower-level space Spawn occupied, and folded his cane across his knees. I want to tell you something, Murdoch said. Spawn waited. When I walked into that holding room, Murdoch said, I had heard your heartbeat. I knew you weren't entirely alive. I knew the second rhythm was something I didn't have a category for. He paused. I also knew that you had restrained yourself in the plaza when you didn't have to. that you had used minimum necessary force against the hand when you could have used considerably more, that the way you moved and held yourself was consistent with someone managing their own power rather than expressing it. You read a lot from a heartbeat. I read everything from a heartbeat, it's what I have. Murdoch's hands were still on his cane. What I'm telling you is that I walked in there knowing what I knew, and I made a decision based on it. Not on what you looked like, not on what S.H.I.E.L.D. classified you as, on what I could actually perceive about what you were. Spawn looked at him. I'm telling you because you're going to leave, Murdoch continued, with the directness of someone who does not waste time approaching what he means. And I want you to know that what happened here in this city in these weeks was real in the sense that matters. Not operationally real, actually real. He paused. You held a dimensional aperture closed with your bare hands to give Strange time to seal it. You dissolved 7 constructs using something that cost you personally to use. You came through that community center door when you didn't have to. Building mattered. You mattered, Murdoch said, not as sentiment. As the specific correction of someone who has seen too many people discount their own presence because they have been told so often that their presence is a problem. The chains were still. Spawn looked at the floor of the space that Strange had made available, which was not home and was not nothing, which was the honest middle of a situation that did not resolve into easy categories. In my world, he said slowly, I spent years telling myself that connection was a liability. That the people I cared about became targets, that operating alone was protection for them as much as for me. He paused. I was right about the targets part, I was wrong about the conclusion. Murdoch said nothing, which was the right response. Wanda, Spawn said. The name cost something to say out loud, it always did. My wife, she's in my world, she doesn't know I came through a portal, she doesn't know I've been here. She doesn't know I think about her every day in a way that makes everything else harder and cleaner simultaneously. You're going back for her. I'm going back because it's my world. Because there are people in it who need what I can do, and because the things I'm fighting there don't stop because I'm gone. He looked at Murdoch. But yes, for her too, in whatever way that's still possible. Murdoch nodded. The nod of someone who understood loving people in ways that could not be simplified and did not require simplification. Hell's Kitchen will be here, Murdoch said. The darkness doesn't relocate. Spawn agreed. It doesn't. They sat in a comfortable silence that had been earned through the specific kind of shared experience that creates it. Two people who operate in the dark for reasons that are their own, and who have recognized in each other a quality of intent that does not require explanation. After a while Murdoch stood, unfolded his cane, and moved toward the exit with the confident precision of someone who has mapped every space he has been in, and does not need to navigate by sight. He paused at the threshold. If you come back, he said, the framework holds your absence. Thor told you that, it's true. A pause. The kitchen holds it too, for whatever that's worth. He left. Spawn sat in the quiet for a long time after, the chains coiled around him in their slow and patient rhythm, the suit moving with the constant subtle motion of something alive in the way necroplasm is alive, and the cold green fire in his eyes was the only light in the room. The transit occurred at dawn. Strange had chosen the timing for metaphysical reasons that had to do with dimensional membrane stability and the specific quality of energy at the boundary between night and day, which Spawn understood in principle and did not require explained in detail. The permanent seal protocol had been completed at 2 in the morning after a final 18-hour session that had left Strange looking like someone who had been awake for 18 hours and had spent them doing something that required absolute precision. The protocol worked on 2 levels simultaneously. It reinforced the dimensional barrier at the point of original incursion, the location above Manhattan where the rift had opened, creating a stable structure that would hold against external pressure indefinitely rather than degrading over months. And it established a transit framework, a controlled mechanism for crossing between the dimensions at that specific point, with specific dimensional signatures registered as authorized for crossing, 2 signatures. Strange had registered Spawn's necroplasm signature as an authorized transit entity. He had not asked permission before doing this. He had simply done it, which was the most practical expression of welcome available in the language of dimensional metaphysics. The Avengers had assembled on a midtown rooftop that gave them the right angle of visibility without being directly beneath the transit point, which was the specific kind of consideration that Rogers made automatically and that communicated without being stated that this was a farewell rather than a security operation. Murdoch was there. He had not been asked and did not explain his presence. Thor stood at the front of the group with the particular quality of stillness that was his version of the expression Rogers wore when something confirmed what he had decided to believe about a person. Natasha stood beside Rogers and said nothing, which was the most honest thing she could offer given that she had been wrong about Spawn once and had spent the subsequent weeks revising her assessment in a direction she would not have predicted and did not regret. Banner was present in person, which communicated something specific given that Banner's risk management protocols usually kept him at a safer radius from high-energy events. Stark had the armor in standby mode but was not wearing it, which was the kind of detail that meant something when Stark was the one making it. Spawn stood at the transit point as Strange completed the final calibration. He looked at the group assembled on the rooftop with the assessment he had applied to everything since arriving, complete and without the comfort of simplification. People who had responded to his arrival with institutional alarm and professional caution and had ended up, through the specific arithmetic of shared danger and honest negotiation and the gradual accumulation of evidence, somewhere considerably more honest than either alarm or caution, not family. He was not going to call it that because it would not be accurate, and because he had a precise enough relationship with language to resist inaccuracy, even when the accurate description was less comfortable. People he had fought beside. People who had fought for things he recognized as worth fighting for. People who would face what came next, Mailbolger's conclusions and Mephisto's longer games, and the ongoing complicated work of maintaining a dimension against everything that pressed against its edges, with better preparation than they would have had if a portal had never opened above their city. Strange completed the calibration. The transit framework activated, a controlled vertical aperture that was nothing like the chaotic rift of his arrival, deliberate and precise and registering on Strange's monitoring spell as stable within acceptable parameters. Through it, barely visible, was the particular quality of darkness that belonged to his world. Not threatening exactly, just different. His different in the way that the darkness of a place you know is different from the darkness of a place you don't. He turned to Strange first. The protocol will hold, Strange said. It was not a question. It will hold, Spawn confirmed. A pause. The silence of two people who have worked closely enough on something genuinely difficult to have developed a specific kind of professional respect that does not require elaboration. The transit framework accommodates bidirectional crossing, Strange said. Your signature is registered. I know. If the situation in your dimension destabilizes in ways that interact with our framework, you'll know, Spawn said. The seal monitors both sides. Strange nodded. The nod of someone who has said the practical things and recognizes that the remaining things are not his to say. Spawn moved to Rogers. Rogers extended his hand the way he had in the plaza on the first day, the same gesture of fundamental human intent that had been the first honest offer made to him in this dimension. They shook. Framework holds your absence, Rogers said. Thor's words, repeated with Rogers' particular directness, which meant he had heard them and agreed with them and was making them his own statement as well as a relay. I know, Spawn said. He moved to Natasha, who looked at him with the assessment that never fully stopped and which he had come to understand was not distrust, but the specific vigilance of someone whose survival had depended on never fully stopping. You were harder to read than most things I've assessed, she said. I don't like that. I know, I was wrong initially. I know that too. Corner of her mouth moved in a direction that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. Don't make me be wrong again in the other direction. Do what I can, Banner, when Spawn reached him, simply said. Thank you for not making it worse. which was the most specific and honest gratitude Banner could offer given his particular relationship with situations that had the potential to be considerably worse than they were. Stark looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has computed more about a situation than he is going to say. Necroplasm, Stark said. If you ever want someone to run analysis on its composition from a purely scientific angle, without any agenda, I'm available. I think we've barely started to understand what it actually is. Maybe, Spawn said. High praise from you, I'm gathering. Highest, Stark almost smiled. Did not quite, but almost. Thor stepped forward last and did not extend a hand. He placed his hand briefly on Spawn's shoulder, the same position as the aim facility, the support of someone with the strength to actually provide it. Asgard has a tradition, Thor said quietly. When a warrior departs for their own realm after fighting beside you, we do not say farewell, we say the word that means the road holds you. He paused. I do not know the equivalent in your language, but the meaning is the same. I understand the meaning, Spawn said. Thor removed his hand and stepped back. Murdoch had not moved from his position at the edge of the group. He said nothing as Spawn approached, which was accurate to who he was, and waited. Spawn stopped in front of him. The building will have the chain marks painted over in a week, Murdoch said. The ones the construct left, probably. No, they're under the paint. I know you will. A silence. Hell's Kitchen, Spawn said. Hell's Kitchen, Murdoch confirmed. Two words that meant everything they meant in both their worlds and nothing that needed to be added to. Spawn turned to the transit aperture. The darkness of his world waited on the other side with its familiar quality, the specific weight of a place that had been shaped by everything that had happened in it, all the violence and grief and stubborn complicated grace of a city that had been fighting itself, and everything else for longer than anyone had been keeping count. He stepped through. The aperture remained open for exactly 4 seconds after his passage, stable and deliberate, and then closed with a precision that reflected the seal protocol's design. Not the violent tearing of his arrival, but the controlled conclusion of a mechanism that had been built correctly and was working as intended. The rooftop was quiet. Thor looked at the place where the aperture had been with the expression he wore when something had concluded in a way that was right without being simple. Rogers looked at it too. He'll come back, Rogers said. Not a prediction exactly. The specific assessment of someone who has learned to read what people are rather than what they say. Yes, Natasha agreed, and she said it without qualification, which was the most honest thing she had said about him since the beginning. The city moved below them in its constant and inexhaustible motion, and the place where the aperture had been held nothing visible, just air and morning light and the ordinary extraordinary sky above Manhattan. But Strange's monitoring spell registered the transit framework, stable and active on both sides, a door that could be opened, waiting. Al Simmons had died in a burning field in North Korea, and made a deal he did not fully understand with a being he should never have trusted, and had returned to a world that no longer had a place for him, wearing a suit made of the consequences of that mistake. That was the beginning of his story. What happened in a dimension that was not his own, across 6 weeks that had no place in any account of his life that anyone in his world would ever read, was something else. Not a chapter. Not an interruption, something more like a proof. The specific kind of proof that does not resolve a question but demonstrates that the question was worth asking. The question in its simplest form was whether Al Simmons was still a person, not a weapon, not an anomaly, not a jurisdictional problem or a supernatural asset or a dimensional crisis requiring management. A person with the specific weight and particularity that the word carries when it is used honestly, the irreducible fact of a consciousness that makes choices and bears their consequences and continues regardless. The Marvel Universe had tried to answer that question the way it answered most things, through institutional process and tactical assessment, and the careful deployment of frameworks designed to address the unprecedented by making it precedented as quickly as possible. It had sent shield and containment fields and scientific analysis, and eventually, a jurisdiction claim from a being who had been in the business of reducing people to negotiable terms for longer than the concept of negotiation had existed. What had actually answered the question was a blind lawyer walking into a holding room with no weapon and offering to be his lawyer. Everything that followed had followed from that. From the specific quality of honesty in that offer, the acknowledgement that whatever Spawn was, he was something that deserved representation rather than management. Murdoch had not known what the necroplasm was, had not known whether Spawn was threat or ally or something the existing categories could not accommodate, had heard a heartbeat that did not belong to any living thing, and had made a decision based on the one thing he could actually perceive clearly: intent. The same intent that had driven Al Simmons through everything that had made him. The stubborn, unglamorous, costly commitment to not letting the world be worse than it had to be. Not heroism in the clean operatic sense that this dimension's greatest champions embodied, something older and less comfortable and more specific. The heroism of someone who has seen what the world costs and has decided to pay it anyway, not because they expect reward or recognition or even success, but because the alternative is to become the thing they are fighting. He had held a dimensional aperture closed with his bare hands. He had dissolved 7 constructs of himself rather than allow a being of ancient and patient malevolence to use his image to manufacture crisis that would expand that malevolence's reach. He had signed a document that said he existed on his own terms. These were not large things in the scale of what this dimension had seen. The Avengers had faced extinction-level events with cosmic consequences and the full weight of galactic civilization in the balance. What Spawn had done was smaller than that, more personal, the kind of difference that does not register in the accounts that history keeps, but that accumulates in the actual lived texture of a place and its people. Hell's Kitchen had chain marks under fresh paint. A children's hospital was still standing. A dimensional barrier was sealed against things that had been pressing against it for 6 weeks with patient and escalating force. A classification document in Strange's filing system said that an independent supernatural entity had been registered in this dimension's metaphysical framework with full autonomy intact. These things would not be undone by his departure. They were the permanent record of a presence, written in the only language that actually mattered. The language of consequences rather than intention. The Marvel Universe was changed in ways it would take time to fully understand. The supernatural order had been disrupted and rebalanced in a single event. Mephisto's jurisdictional claim had been defeated not through force, which would have been temporary, but through a legal and metaphysical instrument built from knowledge that Spawn had brought from outside the framework entirely. The defeat was documented. The witnesses had registered it. The precedent it set that an independent entity could exist outside existing supernatural authority structures with legitimate recognized status was now part of the framework. Mephisto would work around it. He always worked around things, but the working around would require accounting for the precedent, which constrained the options available to him in ways that had not been constrained before. One man's stubborn refusal to sign a contract had created a permanent limitation on the oldest contract writer in the dimension. Strange had the permanent seal protocol and the transit framework, and a considerably deeper understanding of necroplasm's actual metaphysical function than he had possessed 6 weeks ago. This understanding would inform his approach to dimensional barrier maintenance in ways that were difficult to predict specifically, but easy to predict generally. He would be better prepared. The people he protected would be correspondingly safer. The gap between what had been known and what needed to be known was smaller. Ames' research had been destroyed. 14 months of work, the most sophisticated attempt to synthesize supernatural energy that any non-magical human organization had ever mounted, was gone. The researchers were scattered, the facility was contained, and the specific knowledge that had made the research possible had been identified and documented in S.H.I.E.L.'s supernatural division in a way that made future replication considerably more difficult. The thing that had been pressing against the dimensional barrier for 6 weeks had withdrawn. Not permanently. It was not the kind of thing that gave up. But it had withdrawn to recalibrate, to find another approach, to wait with the patience of something that operated outside the urgency of human timescales. The barrier would hold against that recalibration. Strange's protocol had been designed with the specific knowledge of what had been pressing against it, which meant it addressed the actual threat rather than a generalized version of it. These were the lasting changes. The ones that would compound over time in ways that no one in the dimension would be able to fully trace back to their source. The permanent alterations that a presence makes in a place simply by being there and doing what it does in his own dimension. Al Simmons returned to a city that had continued without him, his city. Darker than the one he had left, louder in certain frequencies. The specific weight of a place where the supernatural and the temporal coexisted in a relationship of constant friction, where the gaps between the buildings were occupied by things that the light preferred not to illuminate, where the balance between the darkness and whatever resisted it had been maintained for years by one figure in a necroplasm suit that the city had never officially acknowledged and had never been able to ignore. The balance had held in his absence. Barely, there were new pressures. The 6 weeks had not been empty of development in his world, which did not pause for anyone and certainly did not pause for a man who had temporarily been somewhere else. There were new players in the supernatural landscape, new threats in the alleys and the darkness, new calculations being made by beings who had noticed the absence of the thing that usually disrupted their calculations. And somewhere in the city was a woman named Wanda who had a life that had continued, and that he observed from the distances he maintained not out of indifference, but out of the specific love that manifests as restraint, the love of someone who knows that their presence is also a danger, and has chosen to carry that knowledge rather than impose its consequences. He returned to all of it. The chains settled into the familiar weight of his world's gravity. The necroplasm suit adjusted to the specific dimensional frequency it had been calibrated for, the frequency of his origin, his damnation, his purpose. The cold green fire in his eyes was exactly the temperature it had always been in this place. He was home. Home was complicated and costly and full of things that needed doing. He got to work but somewhere in the metaphysical framework of a dimension that was not his own, in the precise and carefully maintained architecture of Strange's permanent seal protocol. A transit framework remained active. His signature was registered. The door was open. What Mephisto had said about Malebolger's conclusions was true, and the things that those conclusions might eventually set in motion were not the kind of things that resolved without cost or complexity, or the specific kind of intervention that required someone who understood necroplasm from the inside. Strange's seal would hold. The barrier was reinforced, but reinforced was not impenetrable, and the timeline of what was coming was not a question of if but of when. When it came, the transit framework would activate. When it came, the monitoring spell Strange maintained on both sides would register the approach, and the alarm would reach the people who needed to know. When it came, Hell's Kitchen would have chain marks under the fresh paint, and a blind lawyer who would hear the second heartbeat before he heard anything else, and would not be surprised by what that meant. When it came, a rooftop in Midtown would have the specific quality of a place that had been a farewell and was ready to be an arrival. The darkness between dimensions was patient. So was Al Simmons, against all expectation, against the institutional logic of every framework that had tried to classify and contain and manage what he was. Spawn had proven something in a dimension that had seen more proof of more things than almost anywhere in the multiverse. That the thing which makes a person does not dissolve in necroplasm. That intent survives death and damnation and dimensional transit, and the sustained effort of beings far older and more powerful than any individual human to reduce that individual to something usable. That a blind lawyer walking into a holding room with no weapon is sometimes the most powerful thing in the universe. He arrived as anomaly. He left as something this dimension would not forget, not legend, not myth. Something more specific and more lasting than either of those things, a name in a filing system, a signature on a transit framework, chain marks under fresh paint, a seal on a barrier that holds against what presses against it from the other side, Evidence that Al Simmons had been here, evidence that it had mattered. The darkness holds him. The darkness holds. Maury stories await.